Millionaire shocked to see his beloved missing for 10 years, on the streets with triplets. Upon approaching, he discovered a secret that left him paralyzed. Hello and welcome to 80s Love Stories, where I, your favorite narrator, Christopher, bring you an exciting love story straight from the unforgettable 1980s. Get ready for a journey full of nostalgia and incredible twists. Today's story is truly remarkable, with an ending that's sure to touch your heart and leave you amazed. So, stay with me until the very last moment. I hope this experience is unforgettable for you, and may God bless you and your family. Now, let's get started. New York City, 1983. Thomas Bradford stood frozen on the crowded Manhattan sidewalk, his Brooks Brothers suit suddenly feeling too tight around his collar. Through the sea of pedestrians and yellow cabs, he caught a glimpse of something that made his heart stop. A familiar face he hadn't seen in 10 years. Sarah Mitchell. The only woman he had ever truly loved. She was thinner now, her once pristine clothes replaced by worn garments, but there was no mistaking those emerald eyes that had haunted his dreams for a decade. She was hurrying along the street, pushing an old wooden stroller with what appeared to be not one Tars but 3 small children inside. Thomas's legs moved before his brain could process what was happening. He weaved through the crowd, the sound of boomboxes and car horns fading into the background, as he focused on not losing sight of her again. "Sarah!" he called out, his voice barely carrying over the city noise. "Sarah Mitchell!" She turned at the sound of her name, and when their eyes met, the color drained from her face. The stroller stopped abruptly, causing one of the children to let out a small cry. "Tommy," she whispered, using the nickname only she had ever called him by. Standing there on the corner of Fifth Avenue, Thomas took in every detail of her face, the same delicate features he remembered, now marked by years of hardship. Her copper hair, once styled in perfect waves, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. But her eyes, those eyes still held the same spark that had captured his heart all those years ago. We all thought you were dead," Thomas managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah glanced nervously at the children in the stroller, then back at Thomas. "I'm sorry. I can't do this right now. I have to go." She turned to leave, but Thomas gently caught her arm. "Please," he said softly. 10 years, Sarah. At least let me buy you and the children lunch." Sarah looked down at the triplets, 2 boys and a girl, all with familiar copper hair and striking features that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. They appeared to be around 9 years old. "Just lunch," she finally agreed, though her voice trembled slightly. "There's a diner around the corner." As they walked to the diner, Thomas's mind raced. 10 years ago, Sarah had vanished without a trace from their small town in Connecticut. They had been young and in love, planning their future together, when she suddenly disappeared. No note, no goodbye, nothing. The police investigation turned up empty. Her family was devastated. And Thomas had never been the same. Now here she was, alive and with 3 children who looked to be about the right age to have been conceived around the time she vanished. The implications made his head spin. The diner was a typical New York establishment. Red vinyl booths, chrome fixtures, and the smell of coffee and grilled onions in the air. They settled into a corner booth, the triplets excitedly examining the colorful placemats, while Sarah nervously arranged and rearranged the sugar packets. "These are my children," she said finally. "James, William, and Elizabeth." Thomas nodded, unable to take his eyes off the children. James had his mother's nose. William had her smile. And Elizabeth? Elizabeth had Thomas's eyes. "Sarah," he began carefully, "I need to know. Why did you leave? What happened?" Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for her coffee cup. "It's complicated, Tommy. I was young and scared, and I thought I was doing the right thing." "Scared of what?" Thomas pressed gently. Before she could answer, Elizabeth tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mummy, can we have milkshakes?" Sarah's face softened as she looked at her daughter. "Of course, sweetheart." She turned to the waitress and ordered 3 chocolate milkshakes, then looked back at Thomas with a mix of guilt and defiance in her eyes. "Your father," she said quietly, making sure the children were distracted with their crayons. "He threatened me, Tommy. He said he would ruin your future if I didn't disappear." Thomas felt as if someone had punched him in the gut. His father, Richard Bradford, had always been a powerful man in their community, concerned above all else with the family's reputation and his son's eventual takeover of Bradford Industries. "What do you mean he threatened you?" Sarah's voice dropped even lower. "I was pregnant. Tommy, with triplets. Your father found out before I could tell you. He said a teenage pregnancy would destroy your chances at Yale, would ruin everything he had planned for you. He gave me a choice: disappear with enough money to start over somewhere else, or stay and watch him destroy both our lives." Thomas's world tilted on its axis. His father, who had passed away 5 years ago, had orchestrated the disappearance of the woman he loved and his own children. All those years of grieving, of wondering, of trying to move on, all because of his father's manipulation. Before Thomas could respond, the waitress arrived with the milkshakes. The children's faces lit up, and for a moment, the heavy conversation paused as they eagerly grabbed their straws. Thomas watched them, his children, experience what might have been their first ever restaurant milkshake. His heart ached with all the moments he had missed, all the firsts he should have been there for. "I've thought about you every day for 10 years, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "I never stopped loving you, Sarah, never stopped hoping that somehow, somewhere, you were alive and happy." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I wanted to contact you so many times, but I was afraid your father would follow through on his threats. And then, as the years passed, it seemed impossible to explain. The children, they don't know about you." Thomas looked at the triplets again. His children, who had grown up without knowing their father, who had possibly struggled and gone without, while he lived in luxury, blind to their existence. "I want to know them," he said firmly. "If you'll let me, I want to be part of their lives. Part of your life again, if that's even possible." Sarah wiped her eyes with a paper napkin. "It's not that simple, Tommy. We've built a life here. It's not much, but it's ours. I can't just—" "Mom," James interrupted, looking concerned. "Why are you crying?" Sarah forced a smile. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just remembering something." Thomas watched the interaction, his heart breaking and healing simultaneously. They were his family, a family he never knew he had, yet one he already loved fiercely. "Sarah," he said softly, "I know it's complicated. I know it will take time. But please, give me a chance to make this right." The children had finished their milkshakes and were now watching the adults with curious eyes. Elizabeth, particularly, seemed to be studying Thomas's face with an intensity that reminded him of himself at that age. Sarah looked at her children, then back at Thomas. 10 years of secrets, fears, and protective walls stood between them. But there was also 10 years of love that had never died, of a connection that time and distance hadn't managed to break. "Maybe," she said finally, "we can start with another lunch. Next week." It wasn't much, but to Thomas, it was everything. A chance to know his children, a chance to rebuild what his father had destroyed, a chance to prove that some loves are strong enough to survive even the longest separations. As they prepared to leave the diner, Elizabeth suddenly spoke up. "You have eyes like mine," she said to Thomas, touching her own face thoughtfully. Thomas's heart skipped a beat as he met Sarah's panicked gaze. The truth would have to come out eventually, but for now, this small connection was enough. "Yes," he said softly, "I suppose I do." A week later, Thomas sat in his office at Bradford Industries, staring at the framed photo of his father on the wall. The imposing figure of Richard Bradford seemed to glare back at him, as if still trying to control his son's life from beyond the grave. Thomas had spent the past week re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about his father. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Bradford, your 2 o'clock appointment is here." Thank you, Janet. Hold my calls." Thomas straightened his tie, a nervous habit he'd developed over years of corporate meetings, but this wasn't a business meeting. He was about to see Sarah and the children again. They had agreed to meet in his office first, away from prying eyes. When Sarah entered with the triplets, Thomas was struck again by how much they resembled both of them. The children looked around the expansive office with wide eyes, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows and the Manhattan skyline beyond. "This place is huge!" William exclaimed, pressing his face against the glass. "William, "Don't touch the window," Sarah scolded gently, but Thomas waved off her concern. "It's fine. Would you kids like to see something cool?" He pressed a button on his desk, and the electric blinds began to lower automatically. The children gasped in delight. "Can you do it again?" James asked excitedly. As Thomas demonstrated the blinds once more, he caught Sarah watching him with a mix of emotions on her face. She looked beautiful in a simple denim dress, clearly second-hand but carefully maintained. The past week had given him time to process their first meeting, but seeing her again still made his heart race. "I thought we could go to Central Park," Thomas suggested. There's a carousel there that's been around since we were kids." Sarah nodded, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "Tommy, before we go, we need to talk about expectations. The children, they're curious about who you are." Thomas understood her concern. How do you tell 3 9-year-olds that the stranger they just met is their father, that their entire world was about to change? The ride to Central Park was filled with excited chatter from the back seat of Thomas's Mercedes. Elizabeth, who seemed to be the most observant of the 3, kept looking between Thomas and Sarah, as if trying to solve a puzzle. At the park, while the children rode the carousel, Thomas and Sarah sat on a nearby bench. The late summer air was thick with humidity, and the sounds of the city seemed distant compared to the carousel's cheerful music. "Guys, where have you been living?" Thomas asked softly. "Queens," Sarah replied. "I clean houses during the day while the kids are at school. It's not much, but we get by." Thomas felt a surge of anger, not at Sarah, but at the circumstances that had forced her into such a life. "My father gave you money. It didn't last long with 3 babies, Sarah explained. "Everything was so expensive, and I was so young. I didn't know how to manage it properly." Thomas watched as Elizabeth waved from her carousel horse. "They're amazing kids, Sarah. You've done an incredible job with them." "They're good children," she agreed, pride evident in her voice. "Smart, too. Elizabeth won the spelling bee last year, and James is already reading at a high school level." "Just like their mother," Thomas smiled, remembering how Sarah had always been at the top of their class. Sarah's expression grew serious. "Tommy, what do you want from this, from us?" "Everything," he answered honestly. "I want to be their father. I want to make up for lost time. I want—" He hesitated, then continued. "I want to see if what we had is still there." Sarah stood abruptly, walking toward the carousel as it slowed to a stop. "We were teenagers, Tommy. What we had, it was a lifetime ago." But Thomas noticed she couldn't quite meet his eyes as she said it. The children ran up to them, faces flushed with excitement. "Can we get hot dogs?" William asked. "Please?" They found a hot dog vendor, and Thomas insisted on paying. As they sat on the grass eating, he noticed how Sarah kept the children's clothes clean with careful precision, how she made sure they used their napkins, how she seemingly anticipated their needs before they voiced them. She had become such a strong mother, despite everything. "Mr. Bradford," Elizabeth said suddenly, "why do you keep looking at my mom like that?" Sarah choked on her hot dog, and Thomas felt his face grow warm. "Like what?" "Like the way Mr. Rogers looks at his wife in apartment 3B, Elizabeth explained matter-of-factly, "all soft and mushy." James made a gagging sound and William laughed, but Thomas saw Sarah's hands trembling slightly as she gathered their trash. "Elizabeth," Sarah said firmly, "that's not appropriate." But Thomas couldn't help smiling. Leave it to a child to cut straight to the truth. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas found himself falling into an easy rhythm with the children. He learned that James loved baseball, specifically the Mets. William was fascinated by airplanes, and Elizabeth had a collection of rocks she considered precious gems. When it was time to leave, Thomas walked them to the subway station, though it pained him to think of them riding the crowded train back to Queens. "Let me drive you home," he offered. "No," Sarah said quickly. "We're fine taking the subway. The kids are used to it." Thomas wanted to argue, but he understood Sarah was protecting them, not just from potential disappointment, but from the stark contrast between their lives. "Can we see you again?" Elizabeth asked, looking up at him with those familiar eyes. Thomas glanced at Sarah, who hesitated before nodding. "Maybe next weekend," she suggested. As he watched them disappear into the subway station, Thomas made a decision. He couldn't change the past 10 years, but he could change their future. Somehow he would find a way to be part of their lives, not just as a weekend visitor, but as the father they deserved. Back in his car, he pulled out his Motorola Dynatac, one of those new mobile phones that cost a fortune, but were becoming essential for business. He dialed his office. "Janet, cancel my meetings for tomorrow. And get me everything you can find about Richard Bradford's financial transactions from 1973. Focus on any large cash withdrawals or unusual payments." If his father had manipulated Sarah's disappearance, there would be a paper trail. Thomas was determined to understand exactly what had happened and to make sure his father's influence couldn't reach from the grave to hurt his family again. As he drove home to his empty penthouse apartment, Thomas thought about the look in Sarah's eyes when she talked about their past. Despite her words, he could sense that the connection between them was still there, buried under years of hurt and separation. He would have to move carefully, rebuild trust slowly, but for the first time in 10 years, Thomas Bradford felt truly alive. He had a family, and he would do whatever it took to make things right. The autumn of 1983 painted Central Park in shades of gold and crimson as Thomas sat on what had become their usual bench, watching the triplets chase falling leaves. Over the past month, these weekend meetings had become the highlight of his life, though they also filled him with a bittersweet ache for all the years lost. "Dad, look what I found," Elizabeth called out, then immediately froze, her hand covering her mouth in shock at what she'd just said. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Sarah, who had been arranging their picnic lunch, dropped the thermos she was holding. James and William stopped their game, staring at their sister. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. They hadn't yet told the children the truth, though he suspected Elizabeth, with her keen perception, had figured it out on her own. Sarah rushed to Elizabeth's side, kneeling in front of her. "Honey, why did you call Mr. Bradford that?" Elizabeth looked between her mother and Thomas, her lower lip trembling slightly. "I heard you crying last night, talking to Aunt Marie on the phone. You said he was our father, and you didn't know how to tell us." James and William moved closer, their eyes wide with confusion and dawning understanding. "Is it true?" William asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah looked at Thomas helplessly, tears forming in her eyes. This wasn't how they had planned to tell them, but the moment was here, ready or not. Thomas walked over and knelt beside Sarah, facing all 3 children. "Yes," he said softly, "it's true. I'm your father." The revelation sparked a flood of questions from the boys, while Elizabeth simply moved forward and wrapped her arms around Thomas's neck. He held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling decades of emptiness fill with love. "Why weren't you with us before?" James demanded, his voice carrying a hint of anger that Thomas knew he deserved. "It's complicated," Sarah began, but Thomas interrupted gently. "No, they deserve the truth, a simplified version, but the truth." He looked at each child in turn. "I didn't know about you. Someone had kept it a secret from me. If I had known, I would have been there every single day of your lives." "Who kept it a secret?" William asked. "Cars, my father, your grandfather. He thought he was protecting me, but he was wrong, very wrong. Thomas fought to keep his voice steady, but now that I know about you, nothing will keep me away again. If you'll let me be part of your lives." The children exchanged looks, having one of those silent conversations that only siblings, especially triplets, seemed capable of having. "Can we call you Dad?" Elizabeth asked, still holding on to him. "I would like that very much," Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion. James, however, wasn't fully convinced. "Mum struggles to buy us school supplies," he said bluntly. "If you're rich, why didn't you help us?" "James," Sarah scolded, but Thomas raised his hand. "Wait, it's a fair question. I didn't help because I didn't know you existed, but that changes now." He looked at Sarah. "All of it changes now." Sarah shook her head. "Tommy, we've talked about this. We don't need—" "They're my children too, Sarah. Please, let me help." The children watched this exchange with intense interest. Finally, William spoke up. "Does this mean we get to ride in your car more often?" The tension broke as everyone laughed. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, the conversation flowing more naturally now that the truth was out. Thomas learned more about their lives, how they shared one bedroom in a tiny apartment, how Sarah worked extra hours cleaning offices at night to afford their school supplies, how the kids had never had new clothes, always wearing hand-me-downs from church donations. As the sun began to set, Thomas couldn't bear the thought of them returning to their cramped apartment in Queens. He had so much, and they had so little. It wasn't right. "Sarah," he said as they walked to his car. He had insisted on driving them home this time. "I want to help, not just with money, but with everything. The children need their father. And you—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You shouldn't have to struggle alone anymore." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the children climb into the back seat of his Mercedes. "I'm scared, Tommy," she finally admitted. "Scared of depending on someone again. Scared of disrupting their lives. Scared of—" She looked up at him. "Scared of letting myself feel everything I've spent 10 years trying to forget." Thomas wanted to pull her into his arms, to promise her that everything would be okay. But he knew they weren't there yet. Instead, he simply said, "I'm not going anywhere this time. Whatever happens between us, I'm here for them. And for you, in whatever way you'll let me be." The drive to Queens was filled with the children's excited chatter about their dad's cool car. When they arrived at the apartment building, Thomas's heart sank. The neighborhood was rough, the building run down. This was no place for his family. "Let me get you a better apartment," he said as they walked up the creaky stairs. "Something safer, closer to the children's school. Tommy, please." "Sarah, not for you if you won't let me help you. For them." Sarah looked around the narrow hallway, at the water stains on the ceiling, at the broken light fixture they'd been asking the landlord to fix for months. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Inside the apartment, Thomas saw how Sarah had tried to make a home for their children. The walls were decorated with their artwork. The furniture was old but clean, and there were books everywhere, clearly prioritized over other comforts. "Can Dad stay for dinner?" Elizabeth asked hopefully. Sarah looked uncertain. "We don't have much." "Then let me take everyone out," Thomas suggested, "to celebrate." "Celebrate what?" William asked. Thomas smiled at his son. "Celebrate being a family." Later that night, after a dinner that the children declared was the best ever, Thomas drove back to Manhattan with a plan forming in his mind. He would make things right, not by throwing money at the problem, but by being the father and man he should have been all along. First, though, he needed to understand exactly what his father had done. The preliminary investigation had turned up some interesting transactions from 1973, but Thomas knew there had to be more to the story. What else had Richard Bradford done to ensure Sarah's disappearance? As he parked in his building's garage, Thomas's car phone rang. It was his private investigator. "Mr. Bradford, I found something. Something big. Your father didn't just pay her to leave. He threatened her family too. And there's more. You're going to want to see this." Thomas gripped the phone tighter. "I'll be at your office first thing in the morning." The truth about his father's actions was finally coming to light, but Thomas wondered if learning it all might destroy whatever chance he had of rebuilding his relationship with Sarah. Some secrets, once revealed, changed everything. The private investigator's office smelled of stale coffee and cigarettes, a stark contrast to Thomas's pristine corporate environment. Phil Martinez, a former police detective with a reputation for thoroughness, spread several documents across his cluttered desk. "Your father was ruthless," Phil said, pushing a yellowed letter forward. "Look at this. A letter to Sarah's parents, threatening to destroy their small business if they ever tried to contact you." Thomas picked up the letter, his hands shaking slightly as he recognized his father's signature. The threats were explicit. The Mitchells' family-owned bookstore would be bankrupted, their reputation ruined. "There's more," Phil continued. "He had people watching Sarah for months after she left, making sure she wouldn't try to return. Here are the surveillance reports." The reports detailed Sarah's early struggles, moving between cheap motels, trying to find work while heavily pregnant, eventually finding a small room in a Catholic women's shelter. Thomas felt sick reading about how she'd gone hungry some days to save money for baby supplies. My father was still alive when the triplets were born, Thomas said quietly. He knew he had grandchildren and never said a word. He did more than stay quiet, Phil replied, pulling out more documents. He actively worked to keep them in poverty. Every time Sarah tried to get a better job, mysterious calls would be made. No one would hire her for anything but menial work. Thomas stood abruptly, needing to move. He's been dead for 5 years. Why did the interference continue? Because of this. Phil handed him a legal document. Your father set up a trust with specific instructions. A team of lawyers was paid to maintain the situation for 20 years after his death. Thomas stared at the document, his vision blurring with anger. Even from the grave, his father was still trying to control everything. I want those lawyers' names, Thomas said firmly, and I want this trust dissolved immediately. Leaving Phil's office, Thomas drove to Sarah's apartment, his mind racing. How could he tell her that his father's manipulation had extended far beyond that initial threat, that her decade of struggles had been deliberately orchestrated? He found Sarah alone. The children were at school. She took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. What is it, Tommy? She asked, offering him a cup of instant coffee in a chipped mug. Thomas sat at her small kitchen table, noting how the linoleum was peeling at the corners. I found out what my father did, he said quietly. All of it. Over the next hour he explained everything. The threats, the surveillance, the trust designed to keep them in poverty. Sarah listened silently, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug so tightly her knuckles turned white. I always wondered, she finally said, why things never seemed to get better, no matter how hard I tried. Why every opportunity slipped away. Sarah, I'm so sorry, Thomas began, but she cut him off. Don't apologize for him. She stood, walking to the window that overlooked a brick wall. You know what the worst part was? Not the poverty, not the struggle. It was watching the children's dreams get smaller every year, watching them learn to expect less, to want less. Thomas joined her at the window. Let me fix this. Not just with money, but with opportunities, the chances they should have had all along. Sarah turned to face him. And what about us, Tommy? Where do we fit in all this? The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken feelings. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her. Despite everything she'd been through, she was still the same Sarah he'd fallen in love with at 16, stronger now, more guarded, but with the same fierce spirit. I never stopped loving you, he said softly. Even when I thought you were gone, no one else ever came close. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I couldn't let myself think about you. It hurt too much. I had to focus on surviving, on giving the children whatever I could. You did an amazing job with them. They're incredible kids. They are, Sarah agreed, a small smile breaking through her tears. But they deserve more. They deserve everything. Thomas took a chance and reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. What if we did this together? He suggested. Not just for the kids, but for us too. We lost 10 years, Sarah. I don't want to lose any more time. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. Sarah quickly wiped her eyes and opened it to find Elizabeth standing there, looking pale. Honey, why aren't you at school? Sarah asked, concerned. I got sick, Elizabeth explained. The nurse called, but no one answered here, so I took the bus. She spotted Thomas. Dad, you're here! Thomas immediately went to feel her forehead. You're burning up, sweetheart. What followed was a crash course in parenting for Thomas. Sarah efficiently went into mother mode, taking Elizabeth's temperature, preparing a cool compress, making soup. Thomas watched, feeling simultaneously helpless and amazed. I can run to the pharmacy, he offered. What does she need? Sarah bit her lip. Children's Tylenol, but I'll be right back, Thomas interrupted, already heading for the door. He returned not just with medicine, but with a collection of things he thought might help. A soft new blanket, some children's books, a stuffed animal. Sarah raised an eyebrow at the packages, but didn't comment. They spent the afternoon taking care of Elizabeth together, working in a surprisingly comfortable rhythm. When James and William came home from school, they found their sister on the couch, their mother reading to her, and their father making hot chocolate in the kitchen. Dad's still here, William exclaimed happily. "Can he stay for dinner?" James asked, his earlier reservations seemingly forgotten. Sarah looked at Thomas, then at their children, all of them together in their small apartment that suddenly didn't seem so shabby. "Yes," she said softly. "He can stay." That evening, as they ate a simple dinner of spaghetti and meatballs, Thomas looked around the table at his family. Despite his father's best efforts, they had found their way back to each other. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still hurts to heal, trust to rebuild, and a decade of separation to overcome. But sitting there, watching Sarah laugh at William's jokes, helping James with his homework, and checking on Elizabeth's fever, Thomas knew one thing for certain: this was where he belonged. October gave way to November, bringing chilly winds and early sunsets to New York City. Thomas had spent the past few weeks carefully balancing his corporate responsibilities with his growing involvement in his children's lives. Today, he sat in his office, reviewing a stack of papers his lawyer had prepared, papers that would legally establish his paternity and give the triplets his last name. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Bradford, Ms. Mitchell is here." Sarah entered his office wearing a new dress, one of the few things she'd allowed him to buy her, after much insistence that she needed proper clothes for meetings with school administrators and such. She looked beautiful, but nervous. "Are you sure about this, Tommy?" she asked, settling into one of his leather chairs. "Once we file these papers, everything changes. The press will find out. Your board of directors." "I've never been more sure of anything," Thomas replied firmly. "They're my children. I want the world to know it." Sarah twisted her hands in her lap. "It's not just the papers, the kids. They're talking about the new apartment, about changing schools. They're excited, but it's all happening so fast." Thomas had found them a beautiful apartment in a safe neighborhood, near one of the city's best private schools. The lease was signed, but Sarah had been hesitant to move. "We can wait if you think it's too soon," he offered, though it pained him to think of them spending another night in that run-down building. "No," Sarah said quietly. "You're right. They deserve better. She looked around his opulent office. "I'm afraid they'll get used to all this. And then what? And then you'll realize this was a mistake, that we're too different now, that I don't fit in your world." Thomas stood and walked around his desk, kneeling in front of her chair. "Sarah, look at me." He waited until her eyes met his. "You are my world. You and the children. All of this," he gestured to his office, "means nothing without you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I've spent 10 years being strong, never letting anyone help. I don't know how to do this, Tommy." "Then we'll figure it out together." He took her hands in his. "Do you remember our spot by Miller's Creek where we used to meet after school?" Sarah smiled through her tears. "Under the old oak tree. You carved our initials there. You were wearing a yellow dress the first time I kissed you," Thomas continued, "and afterward, you said—" "What took you so long?" Sarah finished, laughing softly. "I've been asking myself that same question every day since I found you again." Thomas squeezed her hands gently. "I don't want to waste any more time, Sarah." The moment was interrupted by his secretary buzzing again. "Mr. Bradford, your son is here. He says it's urgent." They barely had time to stand before James burst into the office, out of breath and excited. "Dad, you have to come quick. William's about to fight Eddie Morrison." "What?" Sarah exclaimed. "Where?" "At school. Eddie's been bullying him for weeks, calling him poor and saying Dad's just pretending to be his father because he feels sorry for us." Thomas was already grabbing his coat. "Where's Elizabeth?" "Trying to stop them, but Eddie's really big and—" "Let's go," Thomas cut him off, guiding both Sarah and James toward the door. "Janet, cancel my afternoon meetings." They arrived at the school to find a small crowd gathered in the playground. William stood facing a boy nearly a head taller than him, while Elizabeth pulled at her brother's arm, trying to stop him. "You're just charity cases," Eddie was saying. "My dad says your mum trapped Mr. Bradford with some sob story." Thomas's voice cut through the playground noise like steel. "That's enough." The children turned, many gasping at the sight of Thomas Bradford in his expensive suit, standing with Sarah and James. William's face was red with anger and embarrassment, Mr. Morrison, Thomas said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in corporate boardrooms. I suggest you apologize to my son immediately. Eddie's bravado faltered. Your son? Yes, my son. William Bradford, along with his brother James and sister Elizabeth. My children, whom I love and am very proud of. Thomas moved to stand beside William, and their mother, Sarah Mitchell, is the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. The playground was silent now, every child and teacher watching the scene unfold. Sarah stepped forward, putting her arms around William's shoulders. But they don't even have your last name, Eddie protested weakly. Thomas pulled the papers from his coat pocket. Actually, we're fixing that today. These papers make it official, though blood already made it true. He looked at the gathering crowd. Let me be very clear. These are my children. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. Eddie, thoroughly cowed, mumbled an apology and slunk away. As the crowd dispersed, William turned to his father. You didn't have to do that, he said, though his eyes shone with pride. Yes, I did, Thomas replied, because it's the truth, and because no one messes with my family. Later that evening, after the papers were filed and a celebratory dinner was shared, Thomas sat with Sarah on the balcony of her soon-to-be former apartment. The children were inside, excitedly planning how they would decorate their new rooms. That was quite a speech you gave, Sarah said, her voice tender. I meant every word. Thomas turned to face her. I know you're scared of letting me in, of depending on someone else. But Sarah, I'm not trying to rescue you. You've already rescued yourself, and our children, 1,000 times over. I just want to love you, all of you. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the city lights. I never stopped loving you either, she finally whispered. I tried, but... Thomas reached over and took her hand, his heart pounding like it had that first time under the oak tree. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, he leaned in. When their lips met, it was like the past 10 years melted away. They were teenagers again, full of hope and dreams, but also adults who had faced pain and separation and come out stronger. Inside, they heard Elizabeth squeal, Look, Mom and Dad are kissing. They broke apart, laughing, as 3 faces quickly disappeared from the window. Well, Sarah said, blushing slightly, I guess that answers that question. Thomas smiled, pulling her closer. What took us so long? December 1983 brought the first snow of the season, transforming New York City into a winter wonderland. The triplets pressed their faces against the windows of their new apartment, watching the flakes swirl against the darkening sky. Do you think Santa will be able to find us at the new address? William asked, his breath fogging the glass. Of course he will, Elizabeth replied confidently. Dad said he'd make sure of it. Sarah, overhearing this from the kitchen where she was preparing dinner, felt a familiar pang of guilt. Previous Christmases had been sparse affairs, with homemade gifts and whatever small items she could afford. This year would be different, though Thomas's enthusiasm for gift-giving had already led to several discussions about not spoiling the children. Something smells amazing, Thomas said, entering the apartment and shaking snow from his coat. The children rushed to greet him, as they did every evening, still not quite believing their father would reliably come home to them. Mum's making pot roast, James informed him. And we're having actual potatoes, not just the instant kind. Sarah felt her cheeks flush at this innocent revelation of their previous circumstances, but Thomas just smiled and kissed her cheek as he entered the kitchen. Real potatoes. What luxury, he teased gently. "'Cause though I seem to remember you making the instant kind taste pretty good too. Since moving into the new apartment 2 weeks ago, they had been adjusting to their merged lives. Thomas spent every evening with them, only returning to his penthouse to sleep. Sarah knew he wanted to suggest they make the arrangement permanent, but he was being careful not to rush her. The school called today, Sarah said, as they set the table together. They want to move Elizabeth into the advanced program after winter break. That's wonderful, Thomas beamed with pride. Did they mention anything about William's art program? Yes, they're very impressed. The art teacher wants him to enter a citywide competition. Their comfortable domestic conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. Sarah went to answer it, expecting the neighbor who had borrowed some sugar earlier. Instead, She found an elegant older woman standing there, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her designer coat dusted with snow. "Margaret," Thomas said from behind Sarah, his voice tight. "What are you doing here?" "Really, Thomas," the woman replied. "Is that any way to greet your mother?" Sarah felt her knees weaken. She had never met Thomas's mother, even during their teenage romance. Margaret Bradford had spent most of her time traveling in Europe, leaving her husband to raise their only son. "Mom, who is it?" Elizabeth called, appearing in the hallway. She stopped short at the sight of the stranger. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she took in Elizabeth's appearance, no doubt noting the striking resemblance to her son. "So it's true," she said coolly. "I've been hearing the most fascinating rumors, but I had to see for myself." She turned to Thomas. "Were you planning to tell me I had grandchildren, or was I supposed to read about it in the society pages?" "Come in," Thomas said firmly, though Sarah could feel the tension radiating from him. "We should talk privately." "Nonsense," Margaret declared, sweeping past them into the apartment. "I want to meet my grandchildren properly." James and William had joined their sister, all three children watching with wide eyes as this fashionable stranger surveyed their home. "Well," Margaret said, examining them, "they certainly have the Bradford looks, though their clothing could use some improvement." "Mother," Thomas warned, but Margaret waved him off. "I'm simply saying what everyone else will be thinking, dear. If they're to be acknowledged as Bradfords, they'll need to look the part. And their mother." She glanced at Sarah's simple dress. "Well, we'll need to do something about that, too." "That's enough." Thomas's voice was quiet but firm. "Sarah and the children don't need to change anything. They're perfect as they are." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Don't be naive, Thomas. You know how our circle works. If you're serious about legitimizing this situation, there will need to be changes, lessons, proper introductions to society." "No," Sarah spoke up, finding her voice. "Your husband already tried to change us, to erase us, actually. We won't let you do the same." Margaret turned to her, surprised by the steel in her voice. "My dear, I'm trying to help. Surely you understand that your current standard of living isn't appropriate for the Bradford name." "Mother," Thomas interrupted, "you need to leave, now." "Thomas." "No. You don't get to come here and judge my family. Dad already robbed us of 10 years together. I won't let you or anyone else interfere now." Margaret drew herself up, clearly unused to being dismissed. "I see. Well, when you're ready to be reasonable about this, you know where to find me." She turned to the children. "Goodbye, dears. Do try to work on your posture." After she left, a heavy silence fell over the apartment. The children looked uncertain, and Sarah felt the old familiar fear creeping back, the fear that their worlds were too different to merge. Thomas broke the silence first. "I'm so sorry about that. I should have known she'd show up eventually." "She's right, you know," Sarah said quietly. "Your world is very different from ours. The children will face more of that kind of judgment." "Then we'll face it together," Thomas replied. He gathered all of them into a group hug. "We're a family. No one gets to tell us we're not good enough. Not my mother, not society, no one." "Does this mean we have to change?" William asked worriedly. "No, buddy," Thomas assured him. "You just keep being exactly who you are, all of you." Later that night, after the children were in bed, Thomas and Sarah stood by the window, watching the snow continue to fall. "I should go," Thomas said reluctantly, as he did every night. "It's getting late." Sarah took a deep breath. "Stay." Thomas turned to her. "What?" "Stay," she repeated. "Not just tonight, forever. Move in with us. Make this official. I'm tired of being afraid of what might go wrong. I want to focus on what's going right." Thomas pulled her close, his heart pounding. "Are you sure?" Sarah smiled up at him. "What took us so long?" Their kiss was soft and sweet, full of promise. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city in a clean white blanket, like a fresh start. Christmas Eve 1983 transformed the Bradford Mitchell household into a wonderland of lights, decorations, and the sweet smell of baking cookies. Thomas had moved in 2 weeks ago, and the apartment was now filled with signs of their merged lives. His books shared shelves with the children's, his coffee mug sat beside Sarah's on the kitchen counter, and family photos covered the walls. Sarah stood in the kitchen, flour dusting her cheeks as she prepared Christmas cookies with the children. The radio played White Christmas, while snow fell softly outside their windows. Thomas watched from the doorway, his heart full at the sight of his family together. "Dad," Elizabeth called, noticing him. "Come help us decorate the cookies." As Thomas joined them at the kitchen counter, he marveled at how natural it felt, this simple domestic scene that he'd missed for so many years. William was concentrating intensely on frosting a star-shaped cookie, while James seemed more interested in eating the sprinkles directly from the jar. "Tommy," Sarah said quietly, pulling him aside, "about tomorrow. I know you wanted to give the children lots of presents, but please tell me you didn't go overboard." Thomas tried to look innocent, but his eyes twinkled. "Define overboard." "Tommy." "They deserve a magical Christmas, Sarah, after all those years of doing without." "Those Christmases were still magical," Sarah interrupted. "We had each other." That was enough. Thomas pulled her close, not caring that her flour-covered hands were getting his sweater dusty. "I know they were. You made sure of that. But please, let me do this, not to make up for the past, but to celebrate our future." Sarah looked up at him, seeing the love and sincerity in his eyes. Okay, but nothing too extravagant. Thomas chose not to mention the 3 bicycles hidden in his office, or the dollhouse he'd commissioned for Elizabeth, or the art supplies he'd bought for William, or the telescope for James. Some surprises were better left unwrapped until the last minute. Later that evening, as they sat around the fireplace, a luxury Sarah still couldn't quite believe they had, Thomas cleared his throat nervously. "I have an early Christmas present I'd like to give all of you," he announced. "But we're supposed to wait until tomorrow," William protested. "This one's special," Thomas said, reaching into his pocket. "It's actually more of a question." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as Thomas moved to kneel in front of her chair. The children gasped in unison. "Sarah Mitchell," Thomas began, his voice thick with emotion. 10 years ago, I lost you because of circumstances beyond our control. When I found you again, I promised myself I would never let you go. You've given me 3 amazing children, and you've shown me what real strength and love look like." He pulled out a small velvet box. "I wanted to ask you this when we were teenagers, but I never got the chance. I'm asking now, in front of our children, in our home, with all my heart, will you marry me?" The ring was simple and elegant, not the ostentatious piece his mother would have expected, but perfect for Sarah. It caught the firelight as he opened the box. "Please say yes," Elizabeth burst out, unable to contain herself. Sarah laughed through her tears. "You 3 knew about this." The triplets nodded enthusiastically. "Dad asked us for permission last week," James explained. "He said we had to keep it a secret," William added. "Which was really hard," Elizabeth finished. Sarah looked at her children's excited faces, then back at Thomas, the boy she'd loved, the man she'd lost, and the father who'd come back to them against all odds. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The children cheered as Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a kiss. When they broke apart, both of them had tears in their eyes. "I have something for you too," Sarah said softly. She went to the bedroom and returned with an old shoebox. Inside was a pressed yellow flower. "Is that—" Thomas started. "From the oak tree at Miller's Creek," Sarah confirmed. "I picked it the day before I left. I've kept it all these years, even when I thought I'd never see you again." Thomas pulled her close, overwhelmed by the revelation that she'd held onto this piece of their past through all the hard years. "Family hug," Elizabeth declared, and suddenly all 3 children were piling onto their parents, creating a tangle of arms and laughter and love. That night, after the cookies were decorated, the stockings were hung, and the children were finally asleep, though they protested they were too excited for bed. Thomas and Sarah stood by their bedroom window, watching the snow fall. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Thomas asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I was thinking about my old Christmas wish," Sarah replied. "Every year when the children would ask what I wanted from Santa, I'd tell them just your smiles. But privately, I always wished for the same thing, that somehow, someday, you'd find us. And now? Sarah turned in his arms, the ring on her finger catching the light. Now I have everything I ever wished for. You, the children, our family together. What about all the fancy society stuff? My mother's still talking about giving you and the children proper training before the wedding. Sarah laughed softly. Let her talk. We don't need to change who we are. Love brought us back together. Love kept me going through the hard years, and love will keep us strong no matter what anyone thinks. Thomas kissed her tenderly. When did you get so wise? Oh, I've always been the wise one in this relationship, Sarah teased. You were just the handsome one. Hey! Their playful argument was interrupted by a small voice from the doorway. Dad? Mum? I think I hear Santa on the roof. They turned to find Elizabeth in her pajamas, her eyes wide with excitement. Pretty sure that's just the wind, sweetheart, Thomas said, lifting her into his arms. Santa won't come until you're asleep. But I'm too excited to sleep. We're going to be a real family now. Sarah joined them, smoothing Elizabeth's hair. We already were a real family, honey. The ring and the wedding just make it official. Come on, Thomas said. I'll tell you a story to help you fall asleep. It's about a boy who fell in love with a girl under an oak tree, lost her, and then found her again years later. As Thomas carried Elizabeth back to bed, Sarah touched the ring on her finger, still hardly believing this wasn't a dream. Their path hadn't been easy, but perhaps that made their happiness now even sweeter. Tomorrow would bring Christmas surprises, and the new year would bring a wedding. There would be challenges ahead, society's judgment, Margaret's attempts to change them, the ongoing adjustment of merging their lives, but they would face it all together, stronger for the years they'd spent apart, grateful for the love that had brought them back together. After all, some loves are strong enough to survive anything, even 10 years of separation, a father's interference, and all the odds stacked against them. Sometimes, love just needs a little time, a chance meeting on a train, and the innocent wisdom of a child to find its way home. Thank you for watching today's story. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a big thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to relive the magic of the 80s every day with our heartfelt stories. May God bless you and your family. And don't forget to click on the video popping up on the screen right now. It's another totally rad story you won't want to miss. See you in the next video, and stay awesome.